Hey Litza, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good, good. Whereabouts are you in the world?
At the moment, I'm in a city about a couple of hours outside of Chicago, where I'm an artist in residence at the University of Wisconsin.
Oh, wow. So do you spend most of your time in the US, or you spend, because I know I see you sometimes in the UK, but do you spend most of your time in the US, and what is it like over there at the moment with COVID?
I think before COVID, I divided my time relatively equally,
Mm-hmm.
but since COVID, I've been stuck here. So I think I got back from London at the end of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went into lockdown here at the beginning of March. So
Oh,
I had spent Christmas here. The original plan was to do a trip in February 2020.
yeah,
But by that point, it was already looking, or I was nervous about it. Everyone else seemed fine. But
yeah.
I had been nervous about it from as far back as just after Christmas. I had started reading about what was going on in Wuhan because my one of my nephews is half Chinese and has family in the province where Wuhan is. So it was on my radar for that reason. So I was really tuned in to what was going on with this after Christmas 2019. Everybody was teasing me about it because like all I would do was talk about this virus and how I was worried about it, and I was reading the news all the time, and everybody's like, I don't know what your problem is, this is gonna be fine. And I even said to one of my family members at the time, I said, I think it's gonna, like, there's gonna be a recession, I think this is gonna cause a lot of problems. They were like, yeah, and that was in January. And of course, who's laughing now?
I know.
come
It,
come March. Yeah, so I just had a sense about it. But the funny thing was, is then when everyone else realized it was as bad as I'd been saying it was going to be, I sort of got tired of reading about it by that point,
mm.
because I'd been so obsessed with it sort of January, February, and so worried about it, talking about it all the time. And everybody else was like, yeah, nothing to worry about here. Um,
But
so
but it is
yeah,
it is a bit crazy though that no one, I mean, even me included, didn't even think about, like, because viruses travel. Like, it's not like there's a riot happening where it can't move. Like, this is a virus where, like, it can go through air, like it moves. So like I find it so funny that none of us like thought, oh, it won't come over here, it won't come to the UK, it's totally fine, we're safe. And then March time, it was then I was working on a job, I had people crying around me, and that was when I was like, this is when it's getting serious now.
yeah, I think it's because I I had not that long ago rewatched Contagion. It was just one of those things, and it's surprisingly similar, other than the fact that in Contagion the virus is much more deadly. But because I'd recently rewatched that not so long before, and then when I was reading about it in Wuhan, I said, well, this kind of feels very similar to that. And I know that they researched that film quite heavily, and they
Mm,
had, epidemiologists that they spoke to for it. I
mm.
think what concerned me is that it was so transmissible,
Yeah, yeah.
because SARS never was. So, like, even, both SARS and Ebola, you need quite direct contact to
Mm-hmm.
transmit. But it was clear that with this one, it was far more transmissible. Not to mention the fact that I wasn't sure how transparent at that stage the Chinese were being. And this isn't a criticism
Mm.
necessarily, but that's just how it felt at the time. So I was thinking, gosh, it seems to me likely that it was kind of circulating in the community there much earlier,
Mm-hmm.
like in November.
Yeah,
So this is what I was thinking, like in January 2020. So
yeah.
kind of working back from that, I was like, well, if they're freaking out now in January is when it was really exploding in China, and in actual fact it had started circulating in November, then theoretically for us it could have started circulating in January, which means we'd be freaking out in March, which is exactly what happened. And I'm not some kind of like prophetic savant. I think probably all epidemiologists thought the same thing. It's just whether you happen to be tuned into the information or not, and I just so happen to be because of these other factors. Anyway, so I canceled. So I didn't go back in February. The job that I was meant to do, I went and did virtually. So we did that. That was a UK job, but we did it virtually sort of March, April. I feel like I finished that in May. And then it was kind of clear at that stage that I wouldn't be going back that summer. I was originally going to go back kind of around my birthday in August, but it's clear that wasn't going to happen. Some of my family that live in England were originally supposed to come over here for the birth of 2 new nephews of ours, twins, but they couldn't come. So I haven't been back since the end of the year 2019, which I think is the longest I've been away, and certainly the longest that I've not seen certain family members or friends there that I've known for like 30 years. So
it's just a bit crazy, isn't it? Like it's just like
every time I would start to think, well, maybe I could plan to go back, usually what's happened is it's gone crazy there. And I was supposed to be having a guest artist come over from the UK to meet with my students here.
Oh,
so
really?
I'm doing this residency here, but they're not able to travel here. And there's a travel ban within the university. So it's just any sort of long-term plans. And you need a little bit of long-term planning when you're going between countries. Have just gone out the window, and everything's become so last minute that, and I've had 2 or 3 jobs I've just had to turn down because I've just thought it's not worth the flight there to quarantine for a few days shoot to then kind of come back here. So luckily, and luckily I had always planned to do this residency, so it kind of worked out anyway.
So
I knew I was going to be here for that.
People who obviously, a lot of people know your name, but if anyone who's listening doesn't know your name, I mean, you have an incredible, massive portfolio of like music videos, a massive kind of portfolio of like commercials, films. I mean, one of my favorite films is Soul Boy and Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Those are my 2 favorite films. I don't know why, I actually love them. And also Shaun of the Dead, one of my favorite films that you worked on. And so, and I now know that you're writing more, but I want to go, before we kind of delve into that sort of world, I'd love to know like where it all started. Like, are your family creative? How did you kind of get into the world of choreography, movement, and then also now into writing?
I think it's interesting because we tend to form those creative identities quite young. Well, many of us do. And I certainly did. Some of that was just a kind of preference that I showed really, really young. And I always find that a bit inexplicable in children as to why so young they'll show preferences for some things and not others. And I've seen that in my nieces and nephews. They'll show a preference or even have an ability. Like one of my sort of nieces, who's kind of grown now as an artist, I remember when she was 2, she could draw a circle unusually well for a 2-year-old. And you could kind of see that there was like an interest and some skill there. And then it has remained throughout her life. And I was a child like that. I could draw really tiny, complete, precise circles at like 1.5, 2. So I just had, whatever leads a child to be interested in doing that. I seem to be interested in doing that. And then I think it's noticed by caregivers and parents and either encouraged or discouraged. And in my case, it was encouraged. So I would say that was kind of the foundation. And then once that foundation starts to form, you start to build an identity around it within the family and maybe within your friendship group of being the creative one. And it just sort of builds from there. And then as you progress through life, you try lots of different domains, and then you start to specialize because there's pressure to do so in
Yeah.
our culture. So that's, I had a hard time specializing compared to other people. I was always really envious of Edgar Wright, who specialized like super young, and like you hear that about Spielberg as well. There are some people who just are only interested in one narrow domain, and they just have total interest in that. And I was never that, so I'm kind of quite envious of that in people, but I was never that. I was always interested in, I trained as a musician. I played in the band. I was first chair. I did ballet training. I did acrobatic gymnastics training. I did a lot of fine art, and that was what I started doing in my undergraduate, specializing in photography, then switched over to costume design, then switched over to theater, then started taking classes in the dance department, and they just kind of cobbled together a degree for me in the end just to get me graduated. They didn't know what to do with me. And I didn't really I'd made a piece when I was an undergraduate. So I took the choreography course. I don't even think I got credit for it. I think I audited it. I'm not even sure like I got credit for it, but I took it with the dance majors, and I made a piece as part of that course. And even looking back now, so I still have the footage of that, which is crazy because this is like way long time ago, like the 80s. But I still have the video of that. And I remember like my teacher at the time sort of saying, you have a knack for this for whatever reason, is this, and later they said to me that they thought I would become a choreographer. I didn't see that at the time. But now that I'm in the position of sometimes being a professor, you can spot those things, even if the person themselves can't spot it in themselves. But at that stage, I still had no interest in specializing in that. I was kind of a little bit more on the theater side of things and the live art, performance art side of things. And then into my 20s decided, okay, maybe I will specialize in choreography. And that's when I did a master's in choreography.
Right. Okay. And what draw you? Because you've done a lot of like commercials, and some people really love it because it's really great money and it's kind of stable work and stuff. And sometimes it can be creative, sometimes it's not because it is commercial work and it's not as creative as own stuff. But what kind of drew you to go and also be really great at commercials, as well as your kind of filmmaking work as well, your feature film stuff?
So I had my own company for about 5 years, and with that company, so I was Arts Council funded, and I made pieces that had either film in them, so they were kind of gallery pieces that had an element of live performance, but also film projection. And then I also made just some straight up films that weren't part of a live piece as well. So I knew other filmmakers as a consequence of that, and I knew other HODs, cinematographers and the like. So I was part of a community where most of the people that I was palling around with and most of the people I knew were kind of consciously within the film industry. So it was probably as a consequence of those connections that when they would need some movement or something of that ilk, they would think of me because they knew I also did that. But I was also very film literate because I directed some of my own films. So it started just like that. But it was also a very conscious decision. I think if I had been completely British and had gone to university like a lot of my colleagues at the time, where they didn't pay tuition, they didn't come out with these enormous student loans. I think if I would have been in that position, I would not have deliberately built a commercial career. I would have stayed running my own company. So it was out of pure financial necessity. I had enormous American student loans. There would be no way I could pay off and remain an artist. It was impossible. You could never earn the amount of money that you would need to pay those off. So it was a very deliberate calculation. And the people I was hanging around with were either HODs within the film industry, or they were running super experimental theater and performance companies, or making really experimental films that were situated more within kind of avant-garde experimental cinema and not commercial. And I remember they were like, what are you doing? They thought I was crazy doing all this commercial work. But, you know, it really boiled down to kind of the downsides of capitalism and the fact that they were able to carry on doing that kind of work because they weren't buried under a mountain of student debt.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy. I think my debt's like 50,000 or something, or 40,000, something ridiculous like
yeah,
that. I don't know when
yeah,
I'm going to pay it, but like it is what
yeah.
there's something weird about the system, because apparently after a number of years, I think it's 10, 15 years, it just gets written off. Apparently so.
Well, it does in the UK, but not in the US.
No, not
So there's a couple of different things about the UK debt. One, I think you only have to pay it when you're earning a certain amount of money.
yeah, which is true.
And
Yeah.
two, I think it eventually gets forgiven. So in the US, neither of those two apply. So you always have to pay them off no matter what, unless you're earning no money. And even then, the interest will accrue. So you're never out from under the shadow of it. So I think that was probably what led me down that path, because I've thought about this a lot. I think I wouldn't have gone down that path so heavily, I think, if I had had more of a choice. Now, there's another part of it, which was just my own fear. So I was writing at that same point that I was doing commercial work. I'd written a short and I'd received funding for it, and to shoot it, like a good amount of funding for it. And we'd even gone, it was set in the US, we'd even gone to the US and done a recce. And at that point, Rob Hardy, who's shot the Mission Impossible films, was attached as the DOP. I had a really good director attached. Yeah. And then there was a changeover in the Arts Council structure, and a different set of people came in, and the funding changed, and then that funding got taken away. And I think I took that personally, rather than just seeing it for what it was, which was these structural changes.
Yeah,
which happens all the time. And I think with maybe a little bit,
when studios, it changes all the time.
It changes all the time. And I think in hindsight, I think with maybe a bit more confidence at the time and a bit more maturity, I would have carried on. I wouldn't have. And instead, I just kind of let that all go to one side and just got really busy doing a lot of commercial work. So I think if I had one thing I would have done different, it maybe would have been to maybe seek out a bit more advice from someone older and more experienced at that stage, rather than just kind of instantly giving up.
Yeah.
So for some reason at that point in my life, I didn't have the same level of persistence around that I do now.
I don't know, but it seems like your focus is very much into the writing aspect now compared to
like I just got offered work without me really having to fight hard for it, whereas with the writing, I felt like I was fighting harder for it, and then when it kind of went away, I got really disheartened.
Yeah. Does it feel like now that you're more focused on your writing than your choreography? Do you feel it's quite 50-50 at the moment?
Oh, no, I'm far more focused on writing, because I'd done that for many, many, many years, and decided if I was going to continue working in that milieu, that it would be my own work again, or like in this case, I'm making a piece with students, rather than being a kind of gun for hire, for want of a better phrase. So,
yeah.
So I'll still take the odd gig on, but it's not something I'm like seeking out in the same way that I might have been before. It purely just came down to time. If you're doing that and all your time and energy is going into that, then it just doesn't leave much left. Also, the shift to needing to use social media in a kind of the self-marketing piece just never sat very well with me. Probably because I'm from a different generation and we didn't do that, and that it was almost considered a little bit gauche or a little bit kind of tasteless to do that. For my generation.
Well, we've spoken about this a couple of times, maybe twice or two times, about like social media and about like how like the younger generation are less experienced, but potentially getting more work because they have more followers rather than people who are really, really experienced. Don't really want to go onto social media. I know like Anthony Van Last, who's a very famous theatre choreographer who we had on the podcast. I spoke to him about this as well, because I don't think he's even on social media. I mean, he
Yeah.
doesn't need to be. He's like a Tony winning like choreographer, has done Mon Mirror, that sort of thing. And you're like, well, he doesn't need to be. But then the industry kind of requires him it sort of to be present, to people to know who he is and his brand and stuff.
It's a difficult thing. I think luckily probably for our generation, you feel like, well, I'm not that far from death, so I can probably just eke it out until then. I think that was the calculation I sort of made, was it felt like way too much effort for something that I don't even enjoy. And I know some people actually enjoy it, and I think great, before it, and I even have colleagues who may be slightly younger than me, who may be just that generation below me, who I think genuinely enjoy it and have no problem with it and will happily post a couple times a day. For me, it's like pulling teeth. It's just never, even other people my age who got really into Facebook, I was never one of them. I never went on there. I never got interested in it. It just didn't, for whatever reason, it just never floated my boat. I was never into it. And it kind of came and went for me. It wasn't something that, and then when it became so pervasive, and when, for instance, I know now casting directors sometimes won't even see an actor unless they have a minimum of 4,000 followers on something like Instagram.
I know.
That's when I started to become even kind of worried about it, because then it felt like popularity was superseding any desire to work on craft.
Yeah.
And I also felt like if you're spending all of your time on that, then when are you actually working on your work? And it's very disruptive to me to have to stop my flow to think about that. And so I've never quite known what to do with it. It's like I got pushed onto it kicking and screaming, partly by agents and the like, kind of forced onto it. I hardly use it. Part of me just thought I should just come off it. Like, what's the point if I have no interest in it? But then I can also see the benefit of it being and like on Instagram, I follow a lot of artists just because I like to look at their work. So I'm not really interested in any of the anything that's said, but I quite like to look at their work. So then I can see the usefulness of it, because it's like virtual gallery then.
Yeah, I love particularly Instagram, because I get to I share a lot of artwork and a lot of paintings, and I love that on my stories, and I even get really inspired when I'm writing pictures and stuff and ideas, because I get really inspired by one, architecture, and two, paintings and art.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a great thing, and also like to collaborate with other people as well. It's such a great networker.
Absolutely. So there's a really positive piece to it. I actually reached out recently to a artist, Patricia Garcia is her name, who's based in Mexico, just because I was completely taken with her work. And I was working on a lookbook for a TV series I'm writing. And I thought, her images would work so well. And I always prefer, when I'm using other people's images in my lookbooks, to credit them. You don't have to, because it's usually an internal document, but I just think it's kind of respectful. So I reached out to her via Instagram, and that was how I connected with her. And I'm including, her images in my lookbook. And so that was an example of it working well. So I've shifted it much more as a tool to kind of connect with other artists, or to look at other people's work. And the part that might be the self-promotion part is the part that I just am like, whatever, I don't care. I don't, I have no interest in that part.
Well, the thing is, you don't need to. When you've worked with one of the biggest directors around at the time, and you've got credits of like these massive feature films and commercials, and people know, and we all know this is a relationship-based industry. So when you've worked with the same directors for a long time, it doesn't matter if you've got Instagram, they'll just come to you first away because they've worked with you a couple of times and they know you can do the job.
Yeah, absolutely. It is relationship based, and I spent a lot of years cultivating those. So yeah, that's my kind of love-hate relationship, not even love-hate, tolerate-hate relationship with social media.
and so obviously I say to a lot of writers in this lockdown period, this has been an amazing opportunity to write, because you have more time in your hand and you're not fixated on what's happening around you, because majority of the time nothing's happening at this moment in time, especially in the UK. maybe more so
Yeah.
in some parts of the US, because like Miami, it's kind of normal at the moment. But like, how have you found the kind of lockdown experience within your writing work, and has that affected, like, for instance, you just talked about you're writing a lookbook for a TV series. Has that affected the way that you write?
The funny thing is I had decided so I think it was 2019 that I had started being a lot more conscious about making this transition to focus more on writing and producing and less on choreography. So I had that whole year. So I wrote 2 features, 2 episodes of 2 TV pilots in that year. So I had a really productive year. And then when 2020 came, the intention was to work on the marketing piece of those. So that's your pitch docs and your lookbooks and you know, any images you might want to include to try, you know, basically to start shopping the projects. So that's what 2020 was always going to be about. And then and so I'd already kind of been locked down in 2019 because I'd been home a lot writing. And then 2020 came, and I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic, that would have been for me in terms of my own process, where I would have been going out into the world a lot more.
Yes.
So it was kind of, you know, so I got tired of it midway through because I'd already spent, you know, much of 2019 in and writing. So I actually found it a little challenging. Even though I'm the sort of person that spends a lot of time at home and I'm very introverted. So for someone like me to get tired of being at home is quite remarkable. It took 6 months, and then I was like, oh yeah, I might be tired of being home now. But that was really a year and 6 months, if you think about it.
Yeah, because
I've been home so much before.
As writers, some people can write and create around other creators in the community, like in a coffee shop or whatever.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not one of those. Yeah, I need total silence.
Yeah, and some people need to sit in a dark room and just be alone for like a couple of weeks and just write by themselves. And I think that kind of process is I find it so fascinating, each kind of writer, and the way that I always kind of reference Stephen King, because apparently Stephen King writes 3,000 or 2,000 words a day non-stop. And then you got like Quentin Tarantino, who writes when he feels like writing, when he has an inspiration. And I find it really fascinating how kind of creativity comes to people, especially in this weird, unique time at this moment where we have COVID around the world.
Yeah, I think everybody has that. I always go in and out. So I'll work very much alone. Then I'll need to kind of reflect off someone else. One of the screenplays I'm writing at the moment, I'm actually collaborating with a director on. So it's super useful because I'll disappear for a couple of weeks, and then I'll send him some pages, and then we'll have like a 2-hour conversation. And that's actually probably seems to work the best for me. If I'm just in it and only analyzing the work myself, I always need external input at some point. But then I go back and I work on my own. Then I'll go back out again, and then I'll go back and work on my own, and then I'll go back out again. Yeah, and in many respects, that's how it was as a choreographer as well. Like I would work by myself in the studio, then the director comes in, or you send the material out and you get feedback, then you go back in, then you send it back out. And so it's this constant process of zooming in and out is the way that it works for me. I know it might not work that way for everybody. And literally, if I'm doing a painting, I'll do that as well. I'll be really zoomed in on a lot of details, and then I'll leave it a couple of days so that I can have look at it like I'm looking at it for the first time, and the way someone else might see it. Or I'll look at it in a mirror sometimes to force myself to see the whole piece instead of just one little detailed area that I'd been noodling around with for ages.
Yeah.
And the thing about Stephen King is he's very focused on writing. That's all he does for the most part. So he's another one like, the Edgar Wrights of the world who are really focused on filmmaking. There are other writers. Pardon?
I said I would only wish I could be like them as well. I'm such a Gemini that I like to do loads of different things, and I only wish that my mind was just like, I'm just going to do this one thing.
Yeah, but I think it's just you just have to find what works for you, and what I think for me it's always a balance about living in the present and having an enjoyable day-to-day life,
Mm.
as well as considering where you might want to go in the future. If you're too future focused, then you might never enjoy any of your day-to-day life
No,
and just be so focused on what you're going to be doing in the future or on some kind of future success.
yeah.
And for me, it's important that I enjoy my day-to-day life, almost
How do
maybe
you
slightly more important than the
how do
future.
you how do you refine yourself in the present when you might be sometimes anxious about the future?
I
Is that,
think you just have to ask yourself, how useful is it being anxious about the future? If
mm,
it's useful because it helps you to put some plans in place that might mitigate some worst case scenarios, then go for it. If it's useful because you can start to push an idea because you're thinking about, well, this is where it might lead, then I think it's useful. If all it does is take you into an anxiety spiral where you're really stressed and unhappy, then I don't see how it's useful. So for
mm,
me, usefulness is always the barometer. And I think being there is usefulness about being present focused. If you're entirely present focused, then you never make any plans. And then it's hard to do any kind of long-term project that requires you to step forward into the future a little bit. So there's
mm.
a downside to that. And then, if you're a monk, then being completely present focused might be entirely useful. And there's a utility for that.
Yeah. So
That's
so do you, so with your, I like that idea, but is it useful? Because obviously, like, for me, that stress is like, and negative energy is just a that useless energy that doesn't serve you anything, like jealousy, all that sort of stuff, getting angry that I remember years ago, I used to get really annoyed that when I was in a coffee shop that they wouldn't have like soy milk, and I'd then and my energy would be like really annoyed for like 10 minutes. And then as I got older, I was like, why am I pushing out this really strange energy into my space over someone not having soy milk in the cafe? And I would kind of reflect on all these like moments where you go, oh, angry or annoyed, and you're like, well, it just let it be, like it is what it is. And so I'm fascinated when you say about useful energy, or is it useful for your time and to be present?
I I think that's just a good barometer, because what for some people a little bit of stress is really useful.
Mm,
For some people they need those time constraints because that's what kind of pushes them forward. So just that little bit of stress is really useful. And for some people, doing something timed is fun. For other people, they get really flustered, and like if they're taking a test and it's timed, they'll do poorly on it. And for someone else, it
mm,
might really help focus them. So I also think it's quite idiosyncratic in terms of what you find useful.
mm,
Um, for some people, a really competitive environment and almost a little bit of envy is useful for them. That's what kind of spurs them
yeah,
forward. It was never useful for me. It never led to a nice place.
mm,
Also, for me, I never liked the idea of approaching everything in the world as a zero-sum game
mm,
where one person loses and one person wins. If you approach everything, if you approach culture, if you approach creativity, if you approach love as a zero-sum game, and if everything is rivalrous, it just, for me, wasn't a very useful space to be in. And
mm,
yet so much of, our industry, particularly the film industry, is rivalrous, and it is presented as a zero-sum game where there
mm.
are winners and there are losers.
Did
And
you?
I remember for me shifting into the idea that whenever I didn't get a job, that meant someone else was celebrating because
Mm,
they did get that job. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And can you appreciate that piece of it? Because
mm.
that's unlimited, that ability to be grateful and to even be part of someone else's gratefulness is an unlimited resource.
Mm.
And
Did
you
you?
don't know what someone else's story is. They might have desperately needed that job far more than you,
Yeah,
you know.
for sure. Just being,
Yeah.
also, I think a lot of people have just been, I think, more grounded in the fact that we are so grateful just to wake up in the morning. I think that's what I think everyone's grateful kind of energy is manifested even more now, especially in lockdown. But so, did you have that sort of mentality like when you first starting in the industry, or did you?
No.
How did that kind of manifest? Like what age did you go, oh, let's take a step back and go, well, okay, this is now I feel like this is what's happening in the industry, and I don't really want to be part of it. I'm going to do my own kind of theory and my own kind of mantra.
I think there were a couple things. One, there's the systemic piece, which I think when you grow up in a culture that's very focused on the individual and very focused on the idea that all of your success or your failure is down to you and you alone, it's very difficult to step outside of that story. That's definitely the American story. So if someone has failed, they are a failure. They have failed in some way. Perhaps they're lazy, perhaps they're this, perhaps they're that. And if someone has succeeded, the idea is they've succeeded completely off their own because they've worked really hard. And what I started to see, if you looked around dispassionately, is that that wasn't actually factually true at all. There were lazy people who were successful through sheer luck. There were hard workers who were unsuccessful through sheer luck. Bad luck or good luck, that existed. There was an aspect of like making the most of opportunities that were presented to you, but it became very clear to me that, you know, there were systemic reasons why people found themselves in the position that they were in. I started to notice that there would be really talented dancers who came from a particular background who weren't in a position where they could afford the insecurity that's part of being freelance. And so they had to drop out and do something else. Sometimes those would be people that came from a different socioeconomic background. Sometimes those would be people that came from a different socioeconomic background and a different gender and a different race. But it was clear that the playing field was not equal to me anyway. And so it bothered me that there was this idea, especially of the auteur in film, that it was down to this one, you know, people would be referred to as a genius, as if they had kind of created all the work, when in actual fact, it was a really collaborative process. And it was a collaborative process that only allowed certain people in through structural issues, not through people being not nice people, not through people making deliberate choices, but through structural issues. So for instance, everybody started to talk about, oh, there's so few women in film. Oh, it's because everybody's misogynistic. Well, that's one way of looking at it. You could say it's all down to personal responsibility. That's not what I saw. I saw structural problems. Whenever someone chose to have a child, 9 times out of 10, it's the woman who will be expected to stay home to look after that child. It's very difficult to look after a child if you're working 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
So the way that the industry was structurally constructed was not conducive to that. And so as a consequence, you had far few female directors, not because they were less talented, not because of these other things, but because of structural issues. And I started to notice that, and notice that nobody talked about it. And even when Me Too happened, again, that was very much an emphasis on, we've got a few bad apples here. It never shifted to really talking about what are the structural problems that might lead to this. For instance, giving one male so much power, a hierarchical structure where one person has so much power over many other people's livelihood. And here's the issue, you know, with freelance. If you have 1 or 2 powerful people who can hire and fire at will on a whim, then that's not a very conducive environment to speaking out or to saying, I'm not getting home to see my family. If you want a family, you shouldn't be in this industry. Well, then you're asking people to make a very big choice quite young. And so what I started to see is these things could not be separated out. They were intertwined with each other. And it was either step outside for a while to kind of reassess how you could approach it differently, or leave it completely. I chose to step outside of it for a while. Through the writing process, I was able to step outside of it, at least temporarily, and focus on the piece that I had a little bit more control over in terms of how my time was being used.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Like how is it? The industry's changed so much slightly over the last kind of couple of years because these people in power have now been kind of taken off their kind of pedestal, and we now have this sort of like cancel culture sort of thing in the Me Too situation. But there's so much more that can be done, and it's going, how does that? And I think it has been more of a conversation now because the industry has stopped, and everyone has stopped because of COVID, and people know what has happened, what's happened beforehand. But because the hamster wheel was running, it was so difficult to.
Yeah.
And I think
And I
now,
think the danger with Me Too, the danger with cancel culture, the danger with that is, again, it's shifting the focus onto individuals. It's shifting the focus onto like changes of heart, rather than really looking at the structures that lead to a lot of these problems in the first place. And I still feel like there isn't enough to stopping and considering, looking at the way a shoot is structured, the way the time is used, the way all of these things are not permanent natural structures. They were created. You know, Star Wars, they shot 8-hour days. We decided at some point we were going to shift to a freelance structure, which benefits some and works against a lot of other people.
yeah,
Brings freedom in some respects, but zero freedom in others. So people feel like they're free, but in actual fact, you're actually not very free at all. So I really started to notice a lot of those things. So it was a shift. It was a shift from me always blaming myself to stopping and seeing the wider structure that I existed within, which I don't think I had done so much when I was younger. I was very focused on, if I lost something, it was a failing of mine or something that I had done wrong. I never stopped to consider what structures might be in place that could help or hinder not only myself, but other people as well. And then you have a choice. You either say, I'll just let it be, even though I think it's wrong, even though I don't think it's working for the majority of people, or you take the first step of thinking about it, and then the second step of saying something about it.
And as we kind of round up, we've touched upon so many interesting sort of topics. We do this thing of what we do, a give back, and I'd love to kind of ask you, what has inspired you? What would you give back to an audience from all the kind of things that we talked about today? It could be like an inspiration thing, or it could just be like take a step back, zoom out. It could be a film that you could be inspired by. What would you give back to our audience, younger audience or older audience?
I think you want to find a balance between finding and appreciating your own process. And I feel like everybody has a creativity within them, and it's about nurturing that, finding that very idiosyncratic process, but then also being able to step out and see how it exists within a wider social structure. So it's that experience of zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out. You know, for so often we've set up this idea of, you know, psychology versus sociology. One, you solve all the problems of the world, one person at a time, by getting everybody into therapy. The other, you solve all the problems of the world by just focusing on the structural, systematic problems. And I think it's actually a marrying of those two things. I think that's what people should aim for in their lives as well as their work. Your work does not exist in a vacuum if you choose to communicate it to other people, but your process can. Your process can be very much your own. It's that oscillation between the individual, the psychological, the social, and that oscillation between process and what you put out into the world, communicating with other people, the oscillation between your own internal journey and the external journey that you take out in the world. I think we can all oscillate between those things, and we can hold more than one idea and more than one state of being at the same time.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on 360 or so. It's been absolutely amazing to have you on, and you've spoken about some amazing things. And I'm like, my brain's like chugging away now, like rethinking like all my kind of choices and the things that, and the way that I see my position of where I'm at in my world and also in the industry at the moment. So I want to say thank you so much for coming on 360 Yourself. It's been absolutely amazing.
That's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So yeah, let me know when it's cut down and put out.
Will do.